All right, let's go ahead and get started. A couple things I want to talk about before we get into the lecture. First and foremost, it's not up yet. I'll have it up this afternoon. There will be a quiz this week. Just like always, it'll go up this afternoon. It will close out Sunday at midnight, so be sure to get that done. Again, log into Blackboard every so often and double check your grades and make sure everything looks what you're expecting, and if you think there's a problem, be sure and let me know. The other thing I want to talk about is our next exam, which is going to happen in 1 week's time. So today we are going to finish chapter 17. On Thursday, I'll cover chapter 18, and then we'll have test number 2 1 week from today, next Tuesday, which will be the 20th. And if you're following along with your syllabus, that will put us back on track. We were behind. We missed a day. I took longer on some chapters, so we are now caught back up. So, trying to think in my head, midterm grades go out at some point. I forget which day it is. We'll turn those in, and so you can check them at my UAHT, whatever the app is, or if you log in online, you can check your midterm grade there. That's not really binding on anything. You can always log into Blackboard and check your grade. It's up to date day to day. So, weekly quiz due by Sunday, and then test number 2, which will cover chapters 16, 17, and 18, 1 week from today. We covered a lot of material. It seems like it was pretty quick. We had our first test, but chapter 16 in particular was a pretty big chapter. Chapter 18 is not that big. Chapter 17 is not that big, but remember chapter 16, the French Revolution, there was a lot of material there, so be sure and study. I don't have the study guides printed. They are up on Blackboard. I will have printed off study guides on Thursday. If you want to go ahead and get started studying, they are up on Blackboard in the study guides folder. And like I said, I'll have printed ones on Thursday. Okay, so quiz this week, test next week. Research papers. Any questions about research project? Any questions about the projects? No? Okay, well, don't put them off for too long, because remember, they're due right before Thanksgiving. That is right at a month. This semester is flying by. It seems to go a little bit quicker every year. So don't forget about that. What else? Anything else? All right, well then let's finish up chapter 17. Then we'll cover chapter 18, and then we'll have our next test. So just to review a little bit what we were talking about last week, we're talking about the Industrial Revolution. And remember, the Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain, and that's actually important for a couple of reasons. We've covered some of those reasons. It's a large empire, lots of natural resources, big market to sell to, and those things are all important. But there's a couple of other things that we haven't spoken about that are going to tie in a little bit more today. But what we finished up with on Thursday of last week, we were talking about the challenges of industrialization and some of the problems that were associated with these new factories. And that's where we're going to pick up today. In particular, I want to remind you, we were talking about the condition of the working class in England, this book by Friedrich Engels, in which he actually went out and he studied. Again, this wasn't anecdotal evidence. He actually went out and gathered data and researched people's lives in England, and he could make certain conclusions. You know, if you look at the expected the life expectancy before the Industrial Revolution and compared it to the life expectancy after the Industrial Revolution, it actually went down. If you look at living conditions, if you look at wages, you know, there are metrics that you can assign and point to and say, yes, this actually made life worse for people. And remember, Ingalls was the son of a factory owner. He was part of this middle class factory owner, as we'll term them today, the bourgeoisie. And he's actually criticizing this revolution in England. So we'll talk more about that today. radical ideas. That's what we're getting into. There are going to be some pretty sharp criticisms of the Industrial Revolution, and not just the Industrial Revolution, but some economic theories in general. All right, here we are, mid to late 1800s, and the world is a very different place than it was 100 years ago. If you compare Europe of the 1750s to Europe of the 1850s, it's a very, very different look. The American Revolution has happened, the French Revolution has happened, the revolutions of 1848 have happened, the Industrial Revolution has happened. A lot of stuff has changed over the past century, and people are looking around and they're trying to make sense of the world that they live in. So they're trying to understand how they got to the place where they are. So they start talking about all these different forces that have been pushing and pulling them along over the past 100 years. And we've already spoken about this to some extent, so this is basically just kind of a wrap-up, a summary. But the first force that has had a major impact was the force of liberalism. And this is the driving force behind the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Remember, it's one of these Enlightenment ideals. It's this idea that people should be free from government control. That's what classical liberalism. I don't know if I mentioned this or not. I certainly should have. Liberalism of the 1700s and liberalism today are two different things. Okay, I do want to point that out. What I would call classical liberalism of the 1700s is very different than modern liberalism of the United States in the year 2020. Classical liberalism is all about freedom from government actions. It's all about being free of government regulations and government rules. It's all about equality, although not necessarily what we would term equality today, because of course back then, in order to be equal, you had to be male. You probably had to be a white male, that owned property. So again, modern liberalism, classical liberalism, two different things. But that was one of the forces. Liberalism, it drove the American Revolution, it drove the French Revolution. Now, it's not widespread. It's only found in the United States, England to a lesser extent, and then France. Remember, the French Revolution started on these principles, but it quickly went off the rails compared to the American Revolution. So it is by no means widespread. And there is quite a bit of criticism because remember, the American Revolution, yes, I mean, there was the Revolutionary War, but especially the French Revolution was incredibly destructive. It spawned these revolutionary wars that consumed Europe. Tens of thousands of people died in France. And so there's a lot of people who say it went too far, but there's also a lot of people who have said that liberalism didn't go far enough. There hasn't been enough change in the world, that there haven't been enough revolutions. Remember, the revolutions of 1848 were founded on this idea of liberalism, and most of them failed, or at least failed to create any long-lasting change. So there's criticism from both ends of the spectrum. Okay. Second major idea that has driven change in Europe up to this point is nationalism. We've already spoken about nationalism. It's been around for a while. It's not going anywhere. It'll be around for a while. Remember, a nation is a group of people. It's a group of people with a shared cultural background. So this idea behind nationalism, just like patriotism. Patriotism is a deep devotion to your country. Nationalism is a deep devotion to your nation, and that's not necessarily the same thing. Nationalism, people began to argue that each nation has a distinct cultural identity. We are German people because we speak German and we eat German food and we wear German clothes. We are Italian people because we speak Italian, because we eat Italian food and we wear Italian clothes. We are Spanish because we, so forth and so on. Nationalism. Each people have their own cultural identity, their own cultural unity, and because of that, they deserve their own political unity. They deserve their own country. We deserve a German state for German people. We deserve an Italian state for Italian people. We deserve a Spanish state for Spanish people. We are a group of people with a shared cultural background. We all practice the same religion. We eat the same food. We speak the same language. And because we have a cultural unity, we deserve political unity and political independence. And so we'll talk about it more in the next chapter, but we begin to, and it's been happening for a while now, but really as we get into the 1800s, we see a wave of nationalism sweep through Europe, and we see, again, the idea we need a German state for the German people. We need an Italian state for the Italian people. We are separate and distinct groups, and we deserve our own political independence. Now, there's a couple of things that happen because of this. Number one major aspect of nationalism is an us versus them outlook. Because when you label yourself, I'm a German, I'm an Italian, I'm a Spaniard, you're by definition saying you're not. I'm German and you're not. I'm Italian and you're not. So it fosters this us versus them mentality. And it almost becomes like this Germany versus the world. We have to stick together because everybody's out to get us. Italy versus the world. We have to stick together because everybody's out to get us. It's an us versus them mentality. We got to stick together because everyone else is out to get us. And that's not good, right? It can lead to paranoia. It can lead to fears that everyone is ganging on you. It creates the mindset that you're being opposed by everyone else. So it's kind of a negative thing. This us versus them mentality. It's Germans against the world. The other thing, and I didn't put it up here on the PowerPoint, but it is important because it's something that's going to be hashed out over the next, I don't know, you can still make the argument today. Another aspect of nationalism, people begin assigning biological factors to it. People begin to talk about the concept blood. And I don't mean blood as a liquid that runs through your veins and carries oxygen, okay. But people begin talking about these biological factors, that to be of the German blood means something special. To be of the Italian blood. And very often these are, outward appearance. To be of the German blood, you were supposed to be blonde-haired and blue-eyed. Even though a lot of them aren't. But they begin to meld these two things together, and the idea is to be German. Yes, there is a cultural aspect that you speak German and you eat German food and you wear German clothes. But there's also a biological aspect to this nationalism. That's what I'm getting at. There is a cultural aspect to this nationalism, but there's also beginning to be a biological aspect to this nationalism. You not only have to speak German and practice whatever religion and eat whatever food, you also have to maybe look a certain way or have to have a certain heritage. This concept of blood. Okay. Third big idea, and this is something new, socialism. Socialism. Now, before we really get into socialism, I want to jump back for a second to a man we've already mentioned, and that was Adam Smith. If you remember, Adam Smith was a Scottish economist. He wrote a book entitled The Wealth of Nations. And Adam Smith is still regarded as Adam Smith is the father of capitalism. Adam Smith is a liberal. He's a classical liberal because in his book, Wealth of Nations, he describes an economic theory that is free from government control. Remember before Adam Smith, back when we were talking about colonizing and all this stuff, remember we were talking about mercantilism, right? Mercantilism was this economic theory that said wealth is represented by gold, wealth is power, wealth is power, wealth is gold, and gold is limited, right? And in order to get as much gold as possible, government should regulate trade. That was mercantilism. Well, along comes Adam Smith and he says, no, there's too many government rules and too many government regulations. So he's a classical liberal. I want to get rid of all that stuff. So under mercantilism, the principal actor is the government. Under capitalism, the principal actor is the individual. And so according to capitalism, the idea is instead of the government running the show, individual property owners run the show. And if you've got $100 to invest, you can go out, you can invest your money in a factory, or if you've got enough money, you can build a factory of your own. And rather than the government driving profits, the company will drive profits. And that's why you, as a capitalist, as someone who has money to invest, that's why you build the factories, because you're going to get that money. That's the incentive. Under mercantilism, you may not have a lot of incentive because a lot of that profit is going to the government. I'm sure people still get wealthy. But the idea was for the government to gather as much wealth as possible because wealth equals power. Under capitalism, the idea is for the private individual to gather as much wealth as possible. Profit. And the more profit you make, the more likely you are to reinvest that money so you get more profit, and that's what drives the economy forward. That's known as laissez-faire capitalism. It's a French phrase. L-A-I... I can't remember if it's S or Z. L-A-I... I guess I could look it up. Hang on. Laissez-faire. Laissez-faire. Laissez-faire capitalism. That is one of the reasons that the Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain and is so successful there. Because people have bought into this idea, I can invest in factories, I can build my own factory, and I can make a lot of money. And they did. That's one of the reasons the Industrial Revolution takes hold in Great Britain, is because they have bought into this idea of capitalism. Now, something you need to know about the capitalist market. Adam Smith didn't believe in government regulations, right? Like I said, he's a classical liberal. He doesn't believe in rules. He doesn't believe in regulations. He believed that the market would regulate itself. The government should stay out. That's what laissez-faire means. It's a French phrase that literally means like hands off. The government should be hands off of the economy. He believed that the market was like a natural, living, breathing organism, and it would regulate itself. Like supply and demand, right? Supply and demand is a type of regulatory force. When supply is high and demand is low, that's going to dictate a certain price. When supply is low and demand is high, that's going to do a certain thing to a price. And it's going to fluctuate. That's okay. That's normal. That's natural. And it will regulate itself. If there is a high price and high demand but low supply, more people are going to make that product because more people want off it. Okay. Well, like I said, the Industrial Revolution happens in Great Britain. It's very successful. Lots of people make a lot of money. They make a lot of products, but it also brings a lot of problems. And this socialism movement really begins in France. And like I said, like the work of Engels, a lot of people are studying the effects of the Industrial Revolution. And they're not liking what they're seeing for a number of reasons. Number one, a lot of people are going to argue that the working class is being exploited. They're doing all the works. They're the ones that are coming in and working 12-hour days, 14-hour days, 6 days a week. And yet it's the factory owner that's the ones getting rich. They're going to point to things like living conditions, working conditions. And even just from a purely economic, people begin to argue that the natural forces of supply and demand, they move too slowly. They're not reacting quickly enough. And people are going to argue, listen, instead of having no government regulations at all, what if the government regulated everything? What if we had what was known as a planned economy? And this actually goes back to the French Revolution. France was having problems. They didn't have enough uniforms, they didn't have enough food, they didn't have enough guns or ammunition or cannon or whatever. They did not have enough to outfit their army to fight these revolutionary wars. So the government stepped in, and the government took control. And we've seen this happen ever since then. It happened in both world wars. The government steps in and says, okay, you have a factory, or you have a shop, or you whatever. Instead of making hunting rifles, now you're going to make rifles for soldiers. And instead of making, women's dresses, you're going to sew uniforms for soldiers. And instead of making food for civilian consumption, you're going to make food for our soldiers. It's a planned economy. The government steps in and says, you're going to do this, and you're going to do that, and you're going to do this other thing. And it was much more efficient because you're not relying on the forces of supply and demand. You're not relying on these forces that might move too slowly. You're not relying on people only making what makes them the most money, right? Well, if I make more money making product A instead of product B, even if the government really needs product B to fight this war, I'm still going to focus on A because that's where I'm making the most money. The government comes in and says, no, we need product B. You're going to make this instead. A planned economy, much more efficient, and it really helped them win some of these wars. That is the hallmark of socialism. So write this down. There are three things that socialism really strives for. Number one is planning, a planned economy. Again, it's the argument of efficiency. So number one, planning, a planned economy. Number two, state regulation of property. State regulation of property. Under Adam Smith's capitalist model, property is owned by the individual, and they reinvest that property to try and make profit. In socialism, the government owns the means of production. Again, because the argument is it will be more efficient. And the idea is the government is not looking to make a profit. The governments are much more interested in things like making sure everyone has a job. And so the government is going to be less likely to exploit their workers to try and make more money. They're much more likely in giving everybody a job, which is what the workers want anyway. So number one, planning. Number two, state regulation of property. And number three, the idea is if you do those first two things, you'll get economic equality. Economic equality. If you've got a planned economy, if the government owns everything and the government's telling everybody what to do, the playing field will be much more level. You won't have factory owners because there will be no factory owners because the government will own everything. And so rather than having one person getting really, really rich, while most people are, the working poor, more of that money can be funneled into the workers and it'd be, again, much more level. That's the idea. So planning, state regulation of property, and the end result is hopefully economic equality. Those are the hallmarks. Those are the tests of socialism. All right, I want to talk about some of these early socialists and what their views were. Count Henry Saint-Simon. He is an interesting guy. And actually, all of these people have something in common. I'll talk about that at the end. But Saint-Simon, he labeled people as parasites or doers. And given that he's a French socialist, you can probably guess who he labeled as a parasite. those were the factory owners, because they sat in the office all day, they never did any real work, as opposed to the factory workers, the doers. Now, he's not against industrialization. He believes that, technology moves forward, society moves forward, and yes, there have to be workers and there have to be planners. Okay, fine. He just wants to see a little bit more money given to the workers, or maybe a lot more money. He envisions he is a utopian socialist. In fact, all of these guys can really be described as utopian socialists. They envision a future where everyone lives and works in harmony. That's what they're working towards. For the middle class factory owners and the working class factory workers can live together in peace and harmony. Charles Fourier, he's a real interesting guy. He was one of the very earliest feminists. He wrote not just about the relationship between factory workers and factory owners. He extended that to this relationship between husbands and wives. So he had some pretty interesting ideas on the institution of marriage. But as far as the economy goes, he's interesting because he labeled the main source of society's problems was poverty. He said, listen, disease, death, crime, all of these things can be linked back to the same genesis. Most of society's problems can be linked back to this idea that you don't have enough money. And if we can just get everybody enough money, we could solve a lot of society's problems. Now think about that. I think he was probably onto something there. A lot of society's problems, death, poor living conditions, disease, crime, theft, a lot of these things are triggered by people not having enough money. And so if we could just make sure that everybody has enough money, everybody would be a lot happier. There would be fewer problems in society. He was one of the first people that I know of to argue for a minimum wage. He says, listen, if we can just guarantee everybody X number of dollars, whatever, francs, we can solve a lot of society's problems. And of course, here in the United States, we have a minimum wage, and it's still controversial. What is minimum wage these days? $10 an hour? I remember when I was in high school and I got my first job, it was like $5.25. Might have been $5.15 an hour. So we have made steps in the right direction. But of course, there are lots of people who make the argument it needs $12 or needs to be $15. But of course, that has ripple effects, because if you make $10 now and minimum wage goes up to $15, well, what if you made $15? Do you stay the same, or do you get an extra 5? There's a lot of problems associated with this, and a lot of things have to go into it. But the idea is an interesting one. Pierre Joseph Proudhon, kind of not a mockery, as an homage to the French Revolution. Remember, we spoke about that pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? Proudhon wrote a pamphlet entitled What is Property? And he had a very simple equation. His property is theft. He says everybody that has something stole it from somebody else. He says the factory owners are stealing from their workers, because again, the argument is they go in, they work 16-hour days, 6 days a week, and they have nothing to show for it. Remember, we spoke about the iron law of wages, this pretty cynical view that people will only be paid as much money to ensure that they come back the next day. He says, listen, they're not getting rich off of this. The people getting rich are the ones sitting up in the office, the factory owners. And they're not doing any of the actual work. Now, the reason they make money is because they had the money to begin with, right? They had the money to invest in a factory. If the factory goes under, factory workers aren't out anything. They have to find a new job. They haven't really lost anything. If the factory goes under, the factory owner loses all of his investment. That's the trade-off. Before I go on, I do need to mention, because I'm pretty sure it's on the test, there is a counter argument to all this. It's called social Darwinism. Write that down. Social Darwinism. These early socialists are pointing the finger at factory owners and saying, you're bad people, right? You're exploiting your workers. You're doing all this just so you can make more money. And the factory owners are saying, listen, that's life. Who was Darwin? Who was Charles Darwin? What was his big claim to fame? Oh, y'all know who Darwin is. Biologist, Miss Beagle, Islands, right? He's the guy who came up with the theory of evolution, right? Back in the 1800s, this was still a fairly new concept. Well, instead of remember, survival of the fittest, that was his argument, right? The animals best adapted to the environment survive, and they pass on those characteristics to their offspring. Survival of the fittest. Well, people take that argument and they apply that to human society, and they say, listen, there are winners and there are losers. I am best suited to excel in this environment. Therefore, I win. I win at life. Sorry that you don't. That's the argument that the factory owners came back with. It's just social Darwinism. It's just survival of the fittest. I'm better suited to survive in this environment. That's why I'm a owner and you're a worker. Social Darwinism. Applying the concept of survival of the fittest to society. I win at life. Sorry you don't. And then there's this guy. Those are all the early French socialists. They're all important. But no one individual will probably have as much impact on socialism as an economic theory than this guy, Karl Marx. Karl Marx, he would be regarded as German. At the time, he was born in Prussia. Prussia eventually becomes Germany. He actually went to law school. His dad wanted him to be a lawyer, but he had no interest in that. And so after law school, he moved to Paris, where he met Friedrich Engels. And Engels and Marx would have a very long working relationship. They were friends, and he would have a pretty big influence. Engels would have a pretty big influence on Marx. And Marx is going to have some pretty interesting ideas. Together with Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx is going to write what will be kind of the Bible of socialism, the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto, in which he takes a pretty dramatic departure from these early socialists. And again, a lot of these early French socialists could be labeled as utopian socialists. They envisioned a world where everyone lived together in peace and harmony, where the factory owner, or at the very least, the state, worked to help the factory worker produce economic equality. Marx says no. That is wishful thinking. There will never be a time where the factory owners willingly help the factory workers. He says, listen, if you look back through human history, all of human history has been a series of class struggles. And he labeled the two sides, the factory owners, the bourgeoisie, and the factory workers, the proletariat. He says, listen, just look at it. Just like feudalism, which was the the system in the Middle Ages. Just like feudalism had been replaced by capitalism, capitalism is going to be replaced by socialism. And it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be a utopian paradise. It's going to be hard. It's going to be a struggle. And it is going to be bloody and violent. So he's not talking about a peaceful transition where everybody, holds hands around the campfire. He's saying that if factory workers want equality, they have to take it. They have to take it by force. History is a series of class struggles. And the current struggle is between the factory owners, the bourgeoisie, and the factory workers, the proletariat. And it is a struggle. It is going to be violent. It is going to be bloody. Now, he still makes the argument that, yes, labor is the source of all wealth. And yes, he makes the argument that labor is being exploited and the factory workers are being exploited. But his argument is, rather than waiting for the factory owners to realize what they're doing, rather than waiting for the state to step in, he says factory workers have to take it for themselves. And his argument is eventually there's going to be enough factory workers that the owners are going to be out. That's his argument. Pretty radical stuff for the time. And of course, it's still pretty controversial today. Karl Marx. Something completely different. We're switching sides. We're switching gears here. There's a social movement we need to talk about. Beginning in the 1850s or so, we're going to see a new, and I say social movement, it was an artistic movement. It was a movement in literature. It's known as Romanticism. Romanticism. And it's not romanticism as in romantic feelings for someone you love, but like romanticism as in a search for an ideal. And romanticism is going to be a backlash against the Enlightenment. Remember, the Enlightenment said we need to use logic and reason in all aspects of our life. And by using logic and reason, we can discover these laws of humanity that govern our actions. Romanticism says, no, that's too cold. That's too calculating. Where is emotion in the Enlightenment? You got to have emotion. So that's what Romanticism is all about. It's this response, this guttural response to whatever, to music, to poetry, to art. Spontaneity, unrestrained imagination. Very big on individualism. It's all about you and your feelings. They were some of the first conservationists. They very much believed in living in harmony with nature. Some of the great romantic artists, William Wordsworth, Victor Hugo, who wrote Hunchback of Notre Dame, Beethoven, classical composer. Okay. But Romanticism, it's a backlash against the use of logic and reason that we found in the Enlightenment. It's much more geared towards emotions. They're always writing about how they feel. Excuse me, what makes them feel a certain way. These are the original emotes. All right. Shifting gears again. Let's talk about urbanization. By the time we hit the year 1900, and now we really are kind of jumping ahead, Western society is urbanized. And what I mean by that is more people are living in cities in 1900 than ever had before. Now, it is still primarily an agrarian society. It won't be until the 1940s that more people, at least here in the United States, more people live in cities than live in the countryside. But it becomes clear that's the path that we're on, right? By 1900, it is very clear people are leaving the country to move to the city. Like I say, it'll be a while before we hit that tipping point where more people actually live in the city than live in the country. But we're definitely at that point today. Western society is urbanized. And that has good things and bad things associated with it. I mean, the positive things is living in a city usually meant that your quality of life at least had the potential to be better. I mean, that's when you think about it, that's why a lot of people move to the city today, or at least, in town, because you have more services available to you. In today's terms, maybe you can get faster internet. You can have a pizza delivered at 11 o'clock at night, or, it takes you 2 minutes to drive down to the grocery store. Life in town could be better, but there's also challenges, right? Because especially at this point in time, there's no running water, there's disease, there's probably an increased risk of theft or crime. So it's good and bad. And it's really interesting, cities as dichotomies, especially back in this time, maybe not so much today, but definitely back at the turn of the century, you would have, it's almost like two entirely different groups of people living in the same city. So you would have those who were, very well off, and they would go to the opera, they would go to museums, and they would spend their afternoons in the park, right? And so you would have that part of the city. And then maybe just right down the block, you would have these tenement slums where 2 or 3 families lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. You would have the factories that are spewing out pollution. You would have where the working class, they went to baseball games and they went to boxing matches and things like that. And so you see these cities as very two-sided. And there's a very clear line. This is what the rich people do, and this is what the working people do. Okay. Real estate is very, very in short supply. And the reason for this is a lot of these cities, even by the time we hit 1900, a lot of these cities are holdovers from very old cities. So you might have a city that actually started in the 1300s or 1400s, back when they were still building walls around their city. And so if you have a wall around your city, it's going to mean your space is limited. People are packed very closely together, and that's a problem for a number of reasons. Disease runs rampant through these early cities. And in fact, cities have a negative growth rate. More people die every year than are being born every year. In these early cities, more people die than are being born. The only way these cities survive is because people keep moving from the country into the cities. That's what replenishes the population. There is no natural growth. In fact, they have a negative growth. So the question again, why do people live there? There's an increased risk of crime, of fire. These buildings are built very closely together. Everything's made of wood. If one building catches on fire, it could burn down the entire city. People are getting sick all the time. Why do people live there? Well, number one, because there are things you can get in the city that you can't get in the countryside. That's, like I said, that's still the case today. Number two, because that's where the jobs were. If you wanted a job in the factory, let's say you're not you're not a property owner. You don't own your own farm. You still have to make a living. You still have to provide for your family. Well, if the only job you can get is in the city working in one of these factories, that's where you're going to go. And as more and more people move to the cities, that's where more and more suppliers are going to concentrate. Remember, you don't have a car at this point in time. Most people don't own horses. If you want to eat, you have to be within walking distance of food. So if the only supply of food is, if the food suppliers know that everybody lives in the cities, that's where they're going to send their food. That's just a self-reinforcing problem, right? All the food is in the city, so people have to live close to the food, which means they're going to send more food to the city, which means more people, and it's kind of a snowball effect. Okay. So by the time we get to the early 1800s, and we're not even to 1900, by the time we hit the early 1800s, people realize that we've got problems. Diseases like typhoid and cholera and measles are just running unchecked through these cities. There's no room for people to build homes. It's incredibly unsanitary. And the problem is you can't live outside the city. Like I said, you don't have a car. There is no such thing as a suburb. You don't have a car that you can hop in and drive into work every day. You have to live within walking distance of your work. You have to live within walking distance of supplies and food. The idea of the city is not going away. We have to find some way of making it work. You need to know this guy's name. Edwin Chadwick. He's a British guy. He's a Benthamite. A Benthamite was a follower of Jeremy Bentham. You don't really have to remember that. But Bentham was very big on utilitarianism, basically doing what works. Chadwick is a really interesting guy. He was a very forward-thinking individual for his time. He was an abolitionist. He believed in women's rights. And he becomes convinced. Now, this is interesting. He becomes convinced that disease and death causes poverty. Remember, when we were talking about the socialists, that was flipped. They believed that poverty caused disease and death. And so if you could just raise everyone up to minimum wage, that would solve most of society's problems. His argument's the flip of that. He says, listen, poverty doesn't cause death and disease. Death and disease actually cause poverty. Again, that kind of, it's got a certain amount of sense to it, right? If you get sick, you can't go to work. If you die, you can't go to work. If you die, you can't provide for your family. They're much more likely to become impoverished. So Chadwick says, listen, if we can just clean up the city, like literally stop people from, just using the bathroom on the street. If we can clean up the city, we can cut down on disease and death, and we can actually make everyone's lives better. He says, listen, it's sewer systems. And it's as simple as that. If we install sewer systems, it's going to make everyone's life better. Number one, we won't have to pay people to clean the streets. It's actually going to be cheaper to install sewer systems. Rather than paying, and that the government had positions where they paid people to go out and clean the streets every day. Rather than paying these people, if we just have a modern sewer system, it's going to save money and it's going to cut down on disease. And so beginning in the mid-1800s, Great Britain is going to build really probably one of the first modern sewer systems. Now, I say modern sewer systems. It was still pretty primitive. Okay, it's not like every house has running water and everybody has a flushing toilet. These sewer systems, they had no idea of like waste management. So all of these sewers ran directly into the river. So that can make a problem in and of itself. So they didn't know necessarily exactly what they were doing, but at least they were on the right track. At least they they were moving in the right direction, and it worked because disease rates began to plummet in London and other British cities where this was put into place. It was working. It's cutting down on disease. Something else regarding disease is the development of germ theory. Nobody knew what caused disease. We're in the 1800s. People had no idea what caused disease. Ancient Greeks believed in the humoral theory, and I think maybe I've mentioned this in class before, that they believed the body was made up of four humors, and if one of your humors got out of whack, that could make you sick. Have I talked about that in class? Maybe it was another class. That's where the practice of bloodletting came from. One of the arguments they made was if you had too much blood, it would make you sick. So you would need to let a little bit of it out from time to time. Bad idea. Don't do that. They believe that bad air made you sick, and it's true. Maybe the reason something stinks is because it's rotten, and that means that there are germs on it. But they didn't connect that in their minds. They just knew that things that smelt bad might make you sick, and they thought it was like the actual air. So they thought that if you wore a handkerchief over your nose, you were protecting yourself from sickness. So again, they were kind of on the right track, but they weren't there yet. It wouldn't be until this guy, Louis Pasteur, comes along that germ theory really began to take hold. Pasteur argued it's not, that your body's humors are out of whack. It's not that you keep smelling something bad and that's going to make you sick. He says they are these little tiny organisms, these microbes, bacteria, germs, that if they get in your body, they replicate and they make you sick. If we can just stop them from getting into your body, we can stop you from getting sick. And Louis Pasteur is going to be the developer of pasteurization, like pasteurized milk. That's the whole point. You heat up the milk, you kill the microbes, and you won't get sick. That's used for other things. I believe Pasteur was also the first maybe to develop a rabies vaccine. I'd have to double check on that. And this really begins to open people's eyes. And so just washing your hands can prevent you from getting sick. Like I say, vaccines were developed. The idea of antiseptics. Used to, if you had to have surgery, you were literally taking your life in your hands, because if the surgery didn't kill you, there's a very good chance that excuse me, you would develop an infection and die. But once germ theory is accepted, people began to realize, hey, if we just keep everything clean, it's much more likely that you will survive this procedure. Joseph Lister, Listerine kills germs. That's where it comes from. Father of antiseptics. Hey, if you clean your hands, if you sterilize your surgical tools, your surgical instruments, people are much more likely to survive. And it works. It works. All right. Another thing that we're going to see happen in the 1800s, the concept of urban planning. Like I mentioned, a lot of these cities had been around maybe for hundreds of years. And if you looked at London or Rome or Paris, they were kind of all hobbled together because you would have the, how am I trying to, there's no rhyme or reason, there's no planning. And so every year somebody would build a building and the city would grow a little bit bigger, but there was no planning for that. And so you would have streets that met at odd angles. You would have buildings that didn't quite join up. It was very hard to put in some of these things like sewer systems because there was no order, no structure to these cities. They had just grown up over time. And, like I said, there wasn't a planning manual from 200 years ago that people were following. Okay, well, if we're going to build a new street, it's got to go here, and we're going to name it this, and the buildings are going to be on this side. And it didn't really work that way. It was all kind of hodgepodge. It was just over time it had built up. Well, the leaders of these cities say, okay, well, this has gone on long enough. We need to go in and we need to do some work. We need to do some urban planning, and they sketch it out, and they say all the streets are going to run at right angles, and they're all going to meet, or excuse me, they're going to meet in straight, or they're going to run in straight lines and meet at right angles. And all the streets that run north and south are going to be numbered, and all the streets that run east and west are going to start with a letter. And we're going to have sewer lines running here. And later, eventually, of course, we're going to put in electrical lines, and we're going to put parks where people can enjoy nature. And they began to plan this out, and it works very well. And so I've got some before and after pictures of Paris. So you can see they take just a motley jumble of buildings that had just grown up over time in a very haphazard fashion, and they replace them. They tear them down, they widen the streets, they put up these large public buildings for everyone to use. And it's a pretty dramatic and a pretty remarkable transformation. Like I say, they began for the first time to plan out things like opera houses and baseball diamonds and parks and things of that nature. Urban planning. And it makes life in these cities much more enjoyable. Public transportation will eventually become important. Now we're really jumping ahead. But as we move into the 1900s and electricity becomes more prevalent, we see things like electric streetcars. People are able to move around in the cities easier. And people even begin living outside of the city. Really, by the time we hit the early 1900s, this idea of the suburb is coming about. This idea where you don't live inside the city anymore, you live outside the city, and you just go into the city every day to do your work, and then you leave and go back home outside the city, where you can own your own home. Right? You're not living in an apartment building. You own your own home. You've got room to spread out. You've got trees in your backyard, out of backyard. By the time we hit the mid 1900s, that's in full swing. But again, that's coming a little bit later. All right, and that is it for chapter 17. So when we come back on Thursday, chapter 18, I'm just going to hit the high points on 18. We'll have our test 1 week from today over 16, 17, and 18. The study guide is up on Blackboard. Weekly quiz will be up on Blackboard this afternoon. Don't forget to take it. And I think that's it. I will see you guys when I see you guys.